Mark had always known his mother to be a creature of habit, disciplined, devout, and deliberate. She woke early, made tea the same way every morning, read her scriptures in silence, and spent most of her time tending to the little routines of a life lived in spiritual solitude. Ever since his father passed away, she had become quieter, but not in a way that worried him. It was the kind of silence that seemed chosen, peaceful, as if she had finally stepped into the stillness she had always been moving toward. But over the past month, something had changed. Not loudly, not all at once, but in subtle, accumulating ways that made Mark uneasy. She had started missing their weekly phone calls, something she had never done before. When they did speak, her voice was softer, but not from age. It carried a strange delay, like she was holding back, speaking from behind something. She responded to his questions with vague reassurances, and sometimes she would drift into silence mid-sentence, as if listening to something else in the room. More than once she referred to them in passing, without explaining who she meant, as though he should already know. Mark brushed it off at first, thinking it was just loneliness or confusion. But the more he listened, the more he noticed the underlying pattern. She no longer spoke as a woman alone. She spoke like someone observed. The final push came on a Sunday evening. She called him unexpectedly and told him not to come over anymore after dark. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. "It's not safe for visitors after midnight," she had said, before hanging up without explanation. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. The image of her house, quiet, old, and tucked away at the end of a wooded road, suddenly felt unfamiliar, distant, and heavy with unseen weight. He knew she had never been one for fantasy or paranoia, yet something in her tone had lodged itself in his chest like a warning. He considered asking a neighbor to check on her, but that felt too invasive, too impersonal. So instead, he took a different approach, one that felt both caring and cautious. He purchased a small, discreet security camera online, one that could connect to his phone and record automatically with motion detection. He told himself it was only temporary, just a safety net, something to ensure she wasn't wandering at night or falling. He waited for a day when she would be out running errands and drove to the house with the camera tucked in his coat pocket. The familiarity of the place struck him immediately. The same creaky porch, the wind chimes she refused to take down even in winter, the faint scent of lavender and dust. Everything looked normal. Painfully, perfectly normal. But as he walked through the hall and into her bedroom, he felt a shift. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, the floor spotless, and yet the air felt different, thicker, as if the walls themselves had been listening to something they couldn't unhear. He installed the camera high in the corner, partially hidden by a decorative shelf. It had a wide-angle lens and infrared capability, nothing fancy but enough to see clearly in low light. He adjusted it to face the bed, the mirror, and the nightstand. Then he left, saying nothing to her when she returned. That night, he waited. Nothing happened. Just soft breathing, light shifting under blankets, the slow rhythm of sleep. The second night was the same. But Mark didn't feel relieved. He felt like something was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment. It was on the third night. The camera activated at 3:12 a.m., but that part would come later. For now, all he had was silence, and a room that looked exactly like it always had, and somehow nothing like it at all. The motion alert woke Mark at 3:16 a.m. He hadn't expected anything, not really. He assumed the camera would pick up the shifting of blankets, the creak of floorboards, the usual movements of an aging woman in the middle of the night. But when the notification blinked on his phone, a knot formed in his stomach, slow and cold. He opened the app, expecting grainy darkness, maybe the flicker of a passing shadow. What he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. The timestamp read 03:12:07, the bedroom, captured in muted colors and static noise, was brighter than he expected. The bedside lamp had been turned on. The overhead light remained off, casting the room in a soft, amber haze. In the center of the frame, his mother stood barefoot on the polished wooden floor, facing the mirror. She wore not a nightgown, but a long, black garment that extended to her ankles. A veil covered her head, neatly arranged, and her posture was unnaturally straight. It took Mark several seconds to realize that she was wearing a nun's habit. One he had never seen before, old-fashioned and ceremonial, as though pulled from a different century. She moved slowly, deliberately. On the vanity in front of her sat several small objects, a single unlit candle, a folded piece of cloth, and what looked like an old book bound in dark leather. Her hands hovered over the table for a moment before she picked up the candle and lit it with a match. The flame wavered, casting long shadows behind her, but her reflection remained oddly stable. Mark squinted at the screen. Something about the reflection felt wrong. Not overtly, just delayed, subtle, almost imperceptible. But he knew her movements well, and in that moment, the woman in the mirror did not move in perfect synchronicity. Then she began to speak. No sound came through. The camera had no audio, but he could see her lips moving, forming words that didn't look like anything he recognized. The cadence of her mouth suggested repetition, not conversation. A chant, a prayer, but it wasn't the Lord's Prayer or Hail Mary. Her face remained calm, almost serene, but her eyes were different. They didn't blink. They stayed fixed on her own reflection, unflinching, as if staring through it. After nearly a minute, she extended her hand and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a small object, round, stone-like, dark in color. She lifted it to her lips, kissed it once, then placed it in front of the mirror. The candle flame twitched violently for a second, then settled. Her breathing, visible now in the shallow rise and fall of her shoulders, slowed, and then she stopped moving altogether. She stood there, unmoving, eyes locked with the image in the mirror, as if waiting for something to look back. Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from the footage. He replayed it again and again, focusing on the shadows, on the objects, on the odd lag of the reflection. He captured still frames, zoomed in, tried to analyze the expressions, but none of it made sense. The habit she wore wasn't a modern one. The book looked hand-bound, too old to be something she would own, and the gestures, so precise, so practiced, felt rehearsed, like part of a rite she had performed countless times before. When the footage ended, she returned to bed as if nothing had happened. She folded the cloth, extinguished the candle, and gently lay down under the blankets. Her movements became ordinary again, slow, tired, human. But Mark couldn't unsee what he had seen, not just the ritual itself, but the certainty in her actions. She wasn't confused, she wasn't sleepwalking, she knew what she was doing, and whatever it wasn't random. It was purposeful, timed, exact. It happened at 3:12 a.m. down, to the second. That time became burned into his mind. 12, EO7, the hour when her body moved, but something else looked back from the glass. Mark arrived at the house just after noon, the sky overcast and still. The neighborhood felt strangely muted, as if muffled by some unseen pressure in the air. The street he had grown up on looked the same. Trimmed hedges, quiet porches, the occasional rustle of wind through trees, but today it felt distant, like a set designed to look familiar without feeling it. He parked across from his mother's home and sat in the car for a full minute, gripping the steering wheel, the image of the video still sharp in his mind. Every movement, every shadow, every silent word she mouthed in front of that mirror at 3:12 a.m. He hadn't slept the night before. He hadn't wanted to. When he finally walked up the path to the front door, he noticed that the wind chimes were gone. They had hung there for years, delicate brass leaves that whispered every time someone passed. Now, just the hook remained. He rang the bell once, then knocked softly. The door opened faster than he expected. His mother stood before him, dressed in her usual daytime clothes. Simple cardigan, long skirt, house slippers. Her hair was tied back neatly, her posture strong as ever. She smiled gently, stepped aside, and welcomed him in. Her voice was calm, her manner warm, and yet everything in her eyes looked quieter, too quiet, like a painting of herself rather than the living woman he had known. The house looked identical to how it had always looked. Nothing out of place. The scent of dried herbs and lemon polish lingered in the air. The television was off, the curtains drawn halfway, the hallway softly lit by afternoon light filtering through linen drapes. Mark stepped inside and felt the old floorboards beneath his feet creak in that familiar rhythm, but something inside him twisted. He made small talk, though it felt hollow, asked how she'd been. She responded in turn, polite and measured, but beneath every word she spoke he felt a delay, like she was responding from a script she had memorized. Her gaze never lingered, her hands never fidgeted. She moved without hesitation, never crossing her arms or shifting her weight, never displaying any of the small human habits of comfort or restlessness. She was still, too still. At one point, Mark glanced toward the hallway that led to her bedroom. The door was closed. It hadn't been closed when he'd left the camera there. He asked if everything was all right in the room. She smiled again, her eyes narrowing ever so, slightly, and said that she was fasting, that the room had become a space of personal reflection, and that she preferred no one enter it during this time. Her tone remained gentle, but the message was final. The door was to stay shut. He sat with her in the kitchen for a while, sipping tea, noting every subtle change. The clock on the wall had stopped ticking. The crucifix by the sink was gone. A small mirror near the back window had been covered with a dark cloth. Her bookshelf still held the same titles, but 3 of them were turned backward, their spines facing the wall. He asked about none of it, but catalogued everything in silence. When she excused herself to the bathroom, he stood up and moved toward the hallway. Every step felt like it echoed. The air was heavier there, cooler. The carpet felt stiffer under his shoes. He approached the door slowly and placed his hand on the knob just for a moment. He didn't try to turn it. He didn't knock. He simply stood there and listened. On the other side, there was no movement, no breathing, just an unnatural stillness that pressed back at him through the wood. He backed away as he heard her returning. She smiled again, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't been performing rituals in the dead of night, as if she didn't know about the camera hidden in the corner of that very room. When he left, she stood in the doorway and waved. Mark drove away with his jaw clenched, his hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, she stood there, longer than she needed to, watching, not waving, just watching. That night, he rewatched the footage from the previous recording, and, for the first time, he noticed something new. Just before the ritual began, before she lit the candle, before she opened the book, she turned her head, very slightly, and looked directly at the lens. It was less than a second, but it was there. She knew, and she had closed the door. The days that followed passed in a strange, static haze. Mark went through his daily motions, but he felt disconnected, as though everything around him had slowed to half speed while his thoughts kept moving at full pace. He couldn't stop thinking about the look on his mother's face as she watched him leave. Not angry, not sad, just aware. Aware of him. Aware of the camera. Aware of what she allowed him to see, and more importantly, what she hadn't. He reviewed the footage again, then again. The gesture toward the lens still struck him as too perfect to be accidental, like an actor glancing into the audience between scenes. And yet she had continued the ritual without breaking pace, as if the surveillance had no power over her. Unable to shake the feeling, he reached out to an old friend, Caleb, a former classmate from college who now worked in linguistic anthropology. Mark sent him a clipped version of the ritual. No identifying features, no explanation beyond a vague note that he had found a private recording of a woman speaking in a strange language. He didn't say it was his mother. He didn't say it was real. Just asked if Caleb could help identify the words. The reply came the next day, short and unsettling. Caleb said he couldn't pin down the language because technically it wasn't one. The rhythm was structured, yes, and there were repeated phonetic clusters, but they didn't match any known linguistic root. Not Latin, not Aramaic, not even glossolalia in the traditional Pentecostal sense. It was something else, something between sound and speech, a pattern with no meaning, unless the meaning was embedded deeper than words. Mark read the message again and again, heart heavy with a dread he couldn't explain. That night, he watched a new clip from the camera. Motion had been detected again, at exactly 3:12. This time, she was already standing when the footage began. The candle was lit, the cloth folded. Her hands rested on the vanity like the stage had already been set, and she had merely stepped back into her place. Her face looked calm but focused, lips moving faster this time, almost trembling with intensity. The same non-language poured from her mouth, each syllable so precisely repeated it gave the illusion of comprehension. But what caught Mark's attention now wasn't just her. It was the space around her. The mirror, the light, the walls. He started noticing slight fluctuations in the brightness, small shifts in shadow, almost imperceptible at first. The candle's flame didn't flicker naturally. It pulsed in a rhythm that seemed to match her speech. The air around her shoulders looked thicker, as if the camera lens was struggling to focus, despite being fixed in place. Then came the stillness. At 3:14, she stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her head tilted ever so slightly, and she went completely still. 2 full minutes passed. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She just stood there, staring. Mark leaned closer to the screen. Something was wrong with the reflection. The light behind her, the contours of her face, the shadows cast. It didn't line up. The mirror image was frozen just a heartbeat out of sync, and when her head slowly moved again, her reflection seemed to hesitate before catching up. Mark paused the video and studied the frame. He took a screenshot, zoomed in. Her face in the mirror wasn't identical. It looked softer, not younger, just different. Eyes that didn't match the stillness of her real gaze. Lips that seemed to part slightly as if forming a silent word, even as her physical self remained still. It felt less like a reflection and more like another version of her, something mimicking her shape from the other side of the glass. He sat back, heart pounding. He told himself it was an artifact. Compression error, a trick of the grain. But some instinct deep in his chest rejected that. This wasn't a glitch. It was intentional, or worse, invited. He returned to the video. At 3:16, her hands moved. Again. She took the black book, opened it to the middle, and began tracing something on the page with her index finger. No writing was visible to the camera, but her motion was rhythmic, as if following a spiral path inward. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Her lips formed a shape that didn't correspond to anything human, her jaw stretching slightly, like the beginning of a yawn that never ended. Her body began to sway, just slightly, not with emotion, not from imbalance, but with purpose, like a pendulum. Mark turned off the video. He sat in silence, staring at his own reflection in the darkened screen. His face looked pale, older, tired, in a way he couldn't explain. His skin prickled with cold. He felt like something had been spoken, even if he hadn't heard it, a message that bypassed language entirely and spoke straight to the marrow. He thought again of Caleb's words. It's not a language. No, Mark realized, it was a code, a pattern, not for understanding, but for opening. And his mother, she had memorized every syllable. The house felt different the moment Mark stepped inside. Not just quiet, hollow. There was a weightlessness in the air, an absence that pressed down more than any physical clutter ever could. His mother had died 3 nights ago, peacefully, they said. In her sleep, no pain, no struggle, just silence. When the hospital called him, he'd felt suspended in time, as if the voice on the phone was speaking from beneath a layer of thick glass. It wasn't a shock, not truly. Something in him had already been grieving for weeks, if not longer. But it wasn't grief that now crept under his skin as he walked through her front door. It was something colder, older, and far less explainable. The house was exactly as she had left it. Her shoes at the door, her keys on the hook, a folded blanket on the couch. The television remote sat untouched on the armrest, and a half-finished mug of tea had long since gone cold on the kitchen counter. The smell of lavender still lingered, faint and distant like a memory trying to hold on. He wandered slowly through the rooms, his steps muffled by the carpet, his breath loud in the stillness. The bedroom door was open. It hadn't been open the last time he was here. Then it had been closed, locked, off limits. Now it stood slightly, ajar, as though inviting him in or daring him. He paused in the doorway, fingers lightly brushing the frame, and stepped inside. The room was lit only by daylight filtering through sheer curtains. Dust floated in the air like suspended ash. Nothing appeared overtly strange. The bed was made, the vanity neatly arranged. But the energy, if such a thing could be felt, was wrong. Not malicious, not even tense, just vacant, like something sacred had been evacuated. He moved toward the dresser, eyes scanning the surface. The black book was gone. So was the cloth bundle. The candle, the stone, even the small wooden box he remembered seeing in the footage, all of it had vanished without a trace. Only a faint circular impression remained on the wooden floor near the foot of the bed. A ring of wear where the varnish looked subtly different, dulled, as if something had stood or sat there for a very long time. He reached out and ran his hand along the spot. The wood felt cold, colder than the rest of the room, unnaturally so. Then he looked at the mirror. It had been cleaned, spotless, polished to such clarity that it looked more like water than glass. His reflection stared back at him, but something about it made him uneasy. He leaned in slightly, watching his own movements, testing them, waiting. For a hesitation, a glitch, anything that might echo what he had seen in the footage. But it moved with him perfectly. Blinking when he blinked, breathing when he breathed. And yet, behind his own eyes in the reflection, there was something too still, as though something else was watching with him, from behind his gaze, wearing him like a mask. He backed away, chest tight. The silence in the room was deafening. Not just the absence of sound, but the fullness of it, like the walls had swallowed every word that had ever been spoken here. He turned toward the corner where the camera had been placed, now removed, the dustless square on the shelf the only sign it had ever been there. He had deleted the last footage the night she died. He hadn't even watched it. Something in him had refused to. But now he wondered, had it recorded anything at all? Or had the act of watching become the final part of the ritual? He left the room slowly, closing the door behind him. He didn't lock it. There was no point. Whatever had occupied that space was no longer confined to it. It had moved, passed on, or passed through. The funeral was quiet, minimal. No church by her request, no rites, just a simple burial, a few words, and the sound of soil meeting wood. Mark stood alone at the grave, hands in his pockets, staring at the name carved in stone. Her face, her real face, flickered in his mind. but it was overlaid with the version he'd seen in the mirror, the one that stared too long, the one that whispered without breath. After the burial, he returned to his apartment. He unpacked, slowly going through old boxes of her belongings that had been sent from the house. Most of it was ordinary: books, scarves, photographs, letters. But in the very bottom of one box, wrapped in white cloth, he found something he hadn't expected. The black book. He didn't remember packing it. He didn't remember seeing it at the house. But it was there, unmistakably real. Bound in thick, cracked leather, its surface worn with age. He sat on the floor and unwrapped it carefully. It opened on its own, as if drawn to a particular page. The writing inside wasn't in English, wasn't in any language he knew, but his eyes followed it. And his mouth. His mouth began to move. The Ngin. Room dimmed, and far behind him, just outside the reach of his vision, the reflection in the blank TV screen smiled.